My name is Hollis Thoms. I'm a composer. I'm a collector of books. I've been a teacher of English and music and a school administrator. And I have an interest in children's books. And so I'm going to show you some of the children's books that I've had and some of the influences that these books have had on my childhood, my children's childhood, and grandchildren's childhood. My mother, who you see here, my mother was a children's librarian for 30 years. She was also a teacher, and she influenced my sisters and I with regard to children's books. She loved children's books. She always read to us when we were children. And so consequently, we got an interest in reading children's books throughout our lives. My mother also was a writer, and at one point in her life she wrote a children's book about Easter. And I remember seeing the rejection letters that she got from the manuscript. She showed them to me. And it wasn't until around her 90th birthday that she was able to have one of her children's books illustrated by my granddaughter Alex. And she did a wonderful job of illustrating the book that my mother wrote many years ago. I've tried to collect many of the books that were read to me in the 50s and 60s when I was growing up. So I had to reconstruct the books, the library that I had, or my mother had, and books that were read to me when I was young. Some of the books that I remember very vividly are the books by Lois Lenski. And I've been able to find a few here: Mr. and Mrs. Noah, At Our House, The Little Auto, The Little Engine That Could, and this is a first edition. And maybe one of my favorite books is Papa Small by Lois Lenski, which really depicts the life of the 1940s and 1950s and growing up in a home. Lois Lenski wrote many other books, and one of the books, which I just have found recently, is Songs of Mr. Small by Lois Lenski. Now, I don't recall seeing this when I was growing up, but this is 1954. That has all songs that were composed by a friend of hers that relates to all the Mr. Small books, Papa Small books, that she published. Also familiar are two Newbery Award winner books that she wrote, The Strawberry Girl and Indian Captive. And these are much more involved with books for older children, but they're wonderful books to read and capture the, the local color of various parts of the United States. My mother also used to read to me, I remember very vividly, at night, The House at Pooh Corner and Winnie the Pooh. And these were wonderful books, chapter books that she would read one chapter a night, and then the next night we would continue the book. One of my favorite books is If Jesus Came to My House, which is, my mother was very religious. And this is a wonderful story about if Jesus came to your house and you were a young person and how you would share your imagined time with him. My wife remembers this book, The Tall Book of Mother Goose. And so both my mother and her mother and her family used to learn nursery rhymes and all these stories from books like this. Perhaps my favorite book set of books was by Opal Wheeler, and this is called Sebastian Bach. And this is about Johann Sebastian Bach, and these pictures that were in here, these black and white pictures, have been instilled in my mind for years. I have Mozart, Beethoven, I have 8 or 9 composer books, and consequently, I became a composer. by this influence of these books. So once I grew up, got married, and had children, we read books to our kids. And of course, the Shel Silverstein books were learning his poems and reciting them and reading and seeing the pictures were wonderful. Of course, Dr. Seuss books, everyone enjoyed those. Frog and Toad books were another set of books. Blueberries for Sal by Robert McCloskey and also Make Way for Ducklings are wonderful books about ducklings and bears and blueberries. And of course, the iconic Where the Wild Things Are. In addition, many words were learned by our children by Richard Scarry's books, the best word book ever. Marvelous books. So these books we read to our kids, and they remembered them very vividly. When I began to collect books, I began to see some children's books that interested me, not just for reading, but for setting to music as a composer. And one of those is Aesop's Fables. And this is one of these very famous books by Milo Winter of Aesop's Fables. And as a result, about 40 years ago, I set to music an opera for children I used in my middle school classes. They learned this opera on Aesop's Fables and presented it to an audience. And we had an interactive session where we asked questions about what happened in each of the fables and what the meaning of it was. Another book that I set to music is Shel Silverstein's A Giraffe and a Half. And this is a marvelous book because it adds things. The text adds things to the giraffe all the way up, and then it subtracts it. So I was able to use with a myriad of Orff instruments, strings, children. I wrote a piece of music that sets this book to music. And most recently, I set Chanticleer, here's a children's book, Chanticleer, by Chaucer, as a one-act opera that was premiered earlier this year. So children's books have been very influential on me. Finally, some books that I didn't expect to find that were children's books this is by Charles Dickens. This is The Life of Our Lord. This is a book that he wrote for his children to tell them about the Bible, the New Testament, Jesus' life, as a kind of a social gospel. He believed in the message of Jesus helping the poor. So he wrote this for his children, and it was only published in 1930. It was in manuscript, and I've seen the manuscript. So this is a wonderful thing. The other thing is there's many books that were written for children in the 40s and 50s, and even earlier about history. And I have a collection of history books on presidents. And I happened to find this book, but also I found a salesman copy in a bookstore. Here are all the books for children with an order form at the back, and you can see the salesman carried this book around and tried to sell these books to parents. And I happened to find this in one antique store and this in one antique store, and this is one of the books that's in the collection. Now, maybe two of my most premier books that I have in my rare book collection one has to do with baseball. And this is a book, the first novel written in 1880 that talks about boys playing baseball. It even mentions games and statistics and scores. It's a wonderful book, the first instance of a novel that depicts playing baseball. And I love to play baseball. This was 1880. And the second book, which is a classic for everybody, and which I read as a youngster and I taught when I was teaching, this is a first edition of Huckleberry Finn. And this book has affected many people throughout the decades since it was published in 1884-85. And so this is one of my prized possessions. This is a first edition, second printing, and it's a wonderful children's adult book to have. So I hope that you've enjoyed me presenting these books. I would hope that this would maybe encourage you to look back at your childhood, see what books affected you, maybe even collect them. Also, what books did you read to your children? Maybe discuss with them what books they remember vividly, and also your grandchildren who might enjoy some of the books that you read when you were a child. So I wanted to share these books, children's books, with you, and thank you, and I'll talk to you soon.